Welcome, everybody, to a new edition of the Maqdisi Street podcast. We are happy to be joined today by Dr. Lara Sheehi, who's a faculty member at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Qatar. She's published extensively in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, especially in the context of colonialism and occupation, in which, as she points out, the traditional categories of psychotherapy, which is usually seen as restricted to the level of the individual subject, need to be adapted and stretched out to the much broader social and collective experiences of occupation and settler colonialism. She's the author of a number of articles on these issues, and most recently, a book co-authored with Stephen Sheehi called Psychoanalysis Under Occupation. So, Lara, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here. And we'd like to begin by asking, as we usually ask our guests, just to explain how you got interested in psychotherapy in the context of the trauma of colonialism, and what brought you, what's the path that you took to get to that field as opposed to any of the other fields you could have studied, academically speaking.
Sure. Thank you, all three of you, for having me on the show, and appreciate all the labor. I've been following along closely, so the people you have on have been nourishing to my soul, particularly over these past 15 months. So I suppose the question has the answer inside of it. I was an English literature major at AUB, and psychoanalysis was alive and well in English literature, not in psychology. So the choice kind of opened up, partially because I actually wanted to not be in the domain of the individual. So growing up in Lebanon and being in AUB at the time of the invasion of Iraq and being part of the demonstrations and being a leftist and being sort of engaged in AUB politics really positioned me so that anything that I was doing felt like it had to be, there was a wajib on me for it to be political. And for me at the time, psychoanalysis actually spoke to that. So psychoanalysis is a theory and a method of the psyche. We can think about Frantz Fanon, for example. That was very much an invitation to me to say, okay, this theory at least has, in theoretical terms, the expansiveness and the capaciousness to sort of take up issues such as contradictions, to think about the individual in the milieu that they're in, to potentially go up against capitalism, because there were leftist Marxist psychoanalysts at the time who were making zines and sort of talking about this stuff. And in the context of Lebanon and Palestine, to really come up with like, what does it mean to be a colonial subject? What does it mean to be under the boot of empire? I don't think I had those words fully, the coherence of that at the time, but there was something about this theory and what it could potentially give that felt very different than the cognitive behavioral therapies that psychology was steeped in, which was very much about locating psychopathology within the individual, having a set of techniques that kind of gave a behavioral response. And very early on, I started to see some of the pitfalls for this, namely the racism that's involved in that, like who has an interior and who doesn't. And psychoanalysis for me kind of presented a different form of that. I was evacuated from Lebanon in 2006, and that's how I started graduate school and psychoanalytically oriented clinical psychology training. And so I was in for a rude awakening in the United States. First time I was there to be like, oh, this theory in practice, perhaps like all other theories, if it's not politicized, actually doesn't cash out on its promises. So I think from that time, I began to learn a grammar or a logic of what does it mean to be critical of these theories? What does it mean to push them to their ends? What does it mean if we're committed to a psychoanalysis that can be practiced and applicable and of any relevance to the global South? And so I think that's what committed me to the type of work that I do. I often tell my students, like, psychoanalysis is going to be okay. Like all systems of power, it recalibrates itself. So like, can we actually be committed to the radical act of constantly disrupting its ability to stabilize and sort of be hand in hand with oppressive state functions in the context of Palestine? We know that there are Zionist psychoanalysts that were central to the making of the state. In the context right now in the United States, there are psychoanalysts that are involved with the anti-trans bills that are being, like everywhere you look in history, or in like torture or any one of the, everywhere you look in history, there's a psychoanalyst somewhere. So on the one hand, the theory with its expansiveness, on the other hand, I feel like an ethical imperative as somebody who was trained in this modality to say, there's actually a lot of violence that comes with it. And what do we do to kind of unpack and disrupt it?
Lara, I have
go ahead,
one
Sam.
question. This might help. Sorry, Sana. There's I think we all get the concept in a way, sort of, moving away. Like we all read Fanon. Obviously, we were all steeped in Fanon from a long time ago. So in a way, that at least the three of us kind of get this idea of the need to expand the kind of the framework or lens or optic of psychoanalysis when extending it to the colonial situation, right? But there was a moment, I don't know if you may not remember this, but it really helped for me at a kind of more I don't know, imaginary level to really grasp what was at stake in your project. You and Stephen were here at UCLA maybe 2 years ago or something like that. I remember we gave a talk together. It was with I think Shireen, maybe Nadira,
Yes.
and
Lubna.
and Lubna, exactly. Something you said, it just everything clicked when you said it. In any case, yeah. But there is this sense in which we no longer live simply in the plane of the individual self. We are necessarily connected to larger systems and structures, and even our sensorium in the world that we come from is sort of is expansive rather than contracted to the level of the individual self.
I was just going to say that, like, I like that you were like, we've all been steeped in Fanon. And I think that's the thought I had coming into psychoanalysis, but it might not surprise anybody that even to this day, Fanon is not really taught in psychoanalytic, institutes and training in the psychoanalytic canon. It is in academia, but it's not in practice. And in academia, Fanon is taken up, as he should be, as a Black revolutionary and a post-colonial thinker. But his clinical oeuvre is really not taken up. And I think this is representative of the split. And so for me, when I read Fanon, as somebody from the global South, post 9/11, experiencing and learning the racial codes of the United States, I was like, it was like coming home for me. I was like, how is this being missed and not being taken up in clinical practice? And what is happening? What is it that allows for this to be split off? What is it that allows for Fanon to be sequestered and his clinical side forgotten? And the number of times that political figures in the history of psychoanalysis, including Freud's own political, leanings, I mean, we can critique him all we want, and I'm fine with that. But the fact that he's all the times that psychoanalysts and psychoanalysis tries to make an actual political intervention, there are ways that that's rewritten, and I think that is the point. And if there's anything I remember about sound or anything, I'm sort of free associating here, but it's about attunement to me. And what is it that we are attuned to? And what is it that we ideologically get sort of tracked into? Because with attunement, there's also misattunement. Whatever you're trained to attune to, you're also trained to write out of history and out of the frame and out of the story something entirely. And the sort of predictability of the fault lines along which that happens was something that became very interesting to me. Like, is it just by chance for a theory that looks at patterns and talks about things, how they happen and the unconscious, that every single time it was something about race or class or sexuality or gender, and certainly the global South and our experiences, that was the thing that was not talked about? And that was the resting point where people are like this, oh, wait a second, that's not psychoanalysis. This is a political agenda. Every single time with predictability. I mean, I don't think there's anything unconscious about that.
Well, on that, Lara, if you could just elaborate a little bit, like Frantz Fanon, who is he? Why is he important? Why is he relevant to our day today, given the fact that Fanon wrote in the 1960s? And why is it that psychoanalysis is important in a place? Since you're saying it's a Western sort of discipline, why is it relevant to people in Doha, in Lebanon, and other parts of the world? Could you just elaborate on those points?
Of course. In many ways, I think it's a contested field and a contested space. And I think Fanon is a centerpiece of that. I think we live in a world in which hegemonic Eurocentric standards dictate everything. And we end up having to be like constantly defending ourselves or on the back foot in reference to Western imports. But if we really look, like you're saying, he's writing in the 1950s in the global South and traveling to all places in Africa and representing the Algerian Revolution. That enough is to tell us, like, this can't just be a Euro practice. There was something that was happening, and people were taking up psychoanalysis in earnest. And we know, of course, that the Black Panther Party was doing that as well. There's so many examples of this happening. And so I'm more attuned to, like, how do we sort of wrench this out of the hands of Eurocentric practice and say there's always been a history that's been disappeared about the ways in which we take up psychic questions. There's, part of what Stephen and I do in our book is we start off with the introduction, looking at the history of psychoanalysis in Palestine, certainly, but also in the Arab world and in our practices in general, in the majalet that there used to be. Like, people were arguing about the centrality of psychology and the psychic space and what does that have to do with our world. So these are not Western inventions, but certainly the hegemony of the practice is very much a Eurocentric one. And so I think that's, for me, the importance of Fanon for me is, one, a reminder that this hasn't been, that the only story is not a Eurocentric story, and the only story is not the story of Freud. So I often actually challenge people and say, what would it be for us to think about the starting point of psychoanalysis as being Fanon and not Freud? And that's not like a momentary psychosis on my part where I don't understand chronology. It's for me to say that, like, the practice of saying that everything we know of a Eurocentric psychoanalysis is actually based on the theft and expropriation from the global South, just like everything else, because it's a European invention, right, is us relocating ourselves in a rich history of these questions for our world. And so the other part is, when we see a Black revolutionary like Fanon, and we see him both as a revolutionary and a psychiatrist, when you look at his writings, Black Skin, White Masks, for example, he starts off by saying he has like these 2 points, and they're numbered. And he says, I'm a psychoanalyst and I'm a Marxist. So there's no place in which he turns away from his ethical commitments to his practice. And of course, we see later on all these incredible innovations he makes in psychology and in psychiatry. And his centerpiece is to be ethical clinicians, we have to be committed to revolutionary praxis. His was never disconnected. And so this question, rather than constantly coming upon this over and over as though this is a new question, as though this is a new moment for us to say, is there a space for this psychology in issues of sort of revolutionary praxis or in anti-colonial struggle? For me, it just goes back and say, this has been a question that's already been settled a long time ago. And it's for us to continue that. It's for us to say, what is it of this moment? Of course, it's not to stay in the moment of Fanon, but to go back and sort of rehash this and say somehow psychology is just separate from that, for me, is not a question. To the contrary, for me, it's a centerpiece. The number of people that have talked to me about mental health, about the ways in which I often talk about psyops, I talk about the ways in which the province of the mind and the psychic interior is not an accidental target of Zionism, for example. It's actually a specific piece where Zionist, whether it's Hasbara or violence, actually exacts its violence over and over and over again. And so I think for me, every time I think about Fanon or that question, that's what I'm really thinking about, is animating it for this particular moment.
No, Lara, I just wanted to follow up and ask about the question of, if you can kind of bring it down a little bit. You talked about Fanon in terms of sort of being quite relevant among, certainly among kind of left or kind of global South scholars in the academy, etc. But in terms of practice, you're saying it's not relevant. It's not really. Can you be more specific, at least more concrete, as to what that means? What does it mean to use, sort of a Freudian analysis versus a Fanonian analysis in this, just in a very
in other words, I think
way?
If I could translate Karim's question, Lara, part of what he's asking is, can you say that non-academically?
Yes. Can I stop being over here and be a little more technical?
Can I come down to our level a little bit?
I will try my best. Thanks, Karim, for the reminder. I think, to the contrary, I think it's actually really relevant, right? So I certainly didn't mean to say it wasn't. The everydayness of it is a reminder that the material world that people live in, you said everydayness of it. That's precisely for me what Fanon was interested in. And he was interested in reminding us that the everydayness, whether it's the kahraba going out in Lebanon or the, breaking the sound barrier, or people's everyday meaning making and negotiations they have to make around poverty, or living in empire and having to hold the contradictions of what it means for us to be committed to Palestinian liberation, but also pay taxes to empire that supplies the bombs. Those were, I think, what Fanon was sort of alerting us to in terms of the everydayness of structural saturation of our psychic life, and then alerting psychologists to, one, the necessity, the ethical necessity for us to keep that in mind, that when we saw symptoms, it's not just to say, oh, this is an individual manifestation of this. It's to understand that both the individual, which might include family relationships and personal identifiers and whatever else is involved in that, always were in constant negotiation and complex matrix with the external forces that also could not be separated from larger structures like colonialism, like capitalism, like patriarchy, and so on and so forth. I think the practical or technical manifestations of that are ones in which, as clinicians, we have to be, first and foremost, it's not on the patient to constantly be reminding us like, hey, actually, my ability to sort of talk about these things or go in this direction with you in therapy, or maybe even have the inclination to bring this up. It's on us to think about what is the entire sort of intertwining framework that this person is bringing into the room. And when I mean like what we attune to is when you are trained in a Eurocentric psychoanalysis, you are always trained to listen to people's material psychologically as bearing out from their individual experience, always at the expense of all those other material conditions around them. And so let's say if somebody comes late to a session, oftentimes the impulse is to read that as resistance against somehow growth. Whereas what has happened is someone has had to take 6 buses to get to your office because in the United States, we don't have a functioning infrastructure for public transportation, or where psychoanalysts usually practice is in the city and people might have to commute to that. Or if somebody is late in payment, that it might not be because of aggression towards the therapist, but because they're having to, figure out how to live their everyday lives and still sustain their families while also getting access to care. So I think it's that nitty-gritty and sort of boring and mundane, but true, even in terms of access or where we imagine psychoanalysis happens. I mean, this is the other piece about Fanon sort of bringing it in and saying psychoanalysis happens in all these spaces, but we are used to thinking about psychoanalysis as happening in a very sterile clinical room between 2 people only. And usually the fantasy of who those 2 people are non-brown, non-indigenous, non-black bodies, right? Even in the fantasy of what we imagine. And for him, he was like, the people I'm seeing are not this, and they have a lot to teach us around this stuff.
So does this mean, does this apply to everybody, or is this just the colonized and those even in the West, sort of in marginal places? Is it applied to a white guy in Vienna, or is this just, particular areas in the global South and in kind of poor areas and those that are in marginalized communities?
Psychoanalysis specifically, or this version of psychoanalysis?
This version.
Yeah, no, I think it applies to everything, because I think when you have a hegemonic way of practicing, I think there are ways it saturates the entire field and actually creates violence across the board, because it's an invitation to, again, localize everything individual. So if we think about capitalism is not just happening in our spaces. Certainly we might, in the global South, feel the ravages of it in different ways because it's usually in tandem with imperialism and colonialism. But the everyday violence that capitalism enacts on everybody and on people's psychological health is something that we all have to take up. And if psychoanalysis in its institutionalized hegemonic form is always inviting people to think about just their individual experience and cleave it off from all the ways in which capitalism has wrecking effects, I think we're missing a huge opportunity. Now, one thing I will say, and I love this sort of a sort of reminder and a challenge to say this, is that I don't think psychoanalysis is the only way. I think it's one of many tools that we could possibly use to remain aligned in our commitments to revolutionary action, right? And I truly mean that. I don't think it's better or more superior than other things. It happens to be, in its theoretical form, something that I feel has expansiveness, but we also see the violence that can be written into that, because how people practice it does not necessarily match up with the expansiveness that it could potentially, sort of enact if we actually went in that direction. So I would never be arrogant enough or aligned enough with something that it would be so sacred that I would say everybody has to do this, or it's the only way that we can sort of function, or people have to go through therapy in this way to heal. But it happens to be the theory and practice that I was trained in, and that's why I feel a responsibility to kind of speak to it in this way.
So, Lara, on that point, I mean, on Fanon, there's this. I mean, Fanon, of course, worked and lived and wrote "Wretched of the Earth," his most famous book, at least for those of us working on these topics in terms of anti-colonialism and colonialism. But he wrote all this in the context of Algeria, in the context of settler colonialism in Algeria. And so when you update Fanon, when you think of Fanon today as a touchstone for you and for all of us, and thinking about our contemporary world, it's as if one is reading Fanon, different chapters of Fanon are operating at the same time. So in other words, there's settler colonialism in Palestine. In Lebanon, where all of us are from, in a sense, there's also a very different kind of sovereignty. It's not settler colonialism, it's something else. It's empire. It's that Fanon didn't really talk about as such. And I'm wondering how you update Fanon in the sense of, because depending on which Fanon which chapter, it seems like we're in different chapters of Fanon at the same time today. So could you just elaborate on that? Yeah.
And if I could add to that, the third one was to Osama's list there, Lara, which is relevant for all, maybe more for right at this moment, me and Osama, or Osama and I, in the sense that those of us who are Arabs in America right now, I mean, in general, but especially the last 15, 16 months, there's something, you know this as well as we do, like it messes with your head being here as an Arab, but it's a different kind of, so there's all these different syndromes that Osama was talking about. I think, and I wonder whether Fanon helps us. Yeah, sorry.
There's also there's also the Karim, of course, is also Arab, and the idea of being an Arab in the Arab world, which is completely and utterly and totally, there's a war there, a psychic war there against the idea of liberation and so on and so forth. So anyway, over to you, Lara. Sorry.
Basically, we're asking you for therapy here. So.
Hey, I love it. I'm always the invited shrink on podcasts, so I'm good with it. I think the way that I think about it is you're right. I think we can sort of reach to Fanon, and I think it's not by chance that people did reach to Fanon immediately after Al-Tawafan al-Aqsa, right? Because there's something so clear. I think that's what I reach to across the board, that for the thing that Fanon for me centers the most is a reading of a logic of oppression. So he was talking about colonialism in that particular time frame. But the reason I think we can pick up Fanon and feel like he's speaking to us like a comrade today, no matter where you are and what your sort of location in the world is or how you enter oppression, is because he was committed to what I call like a militant clarity. And he was unrelenting in this. He was unrelenting in naming, acknowledging, and listing out for us the conditions that created suffering, which led to psychic suffering, and the structures that really wanted to hide in plain sight. But he realized actually part of the power for us in terms of like people power or power, from bottom up or whatever, how we want to see it, revolutionary power, was for us to be in the habit of naming things in an unflinching way, right? So whether I'm in, the United States or in Lebanon or in Palestine, what does it mean to commit to this type of reading the logics and reading how they unfold. And I think this was one of the things in Black Skin, White Masks, I think in the so-called dependency complex, that chapter. I remember reading this as a graduate student, and in it he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, he says something like, it's not for us to compare racisms. Racism is racism is racism. And at the time, I couldn't understand this. I was like, of course there are certain racisms that are worse than others, and you can look at sort of slavery and all. I think now I understand what he meant, is that if you're looking at the logic of racism, then we can see the logic of Zionism. Then we can see the logic of patriarchy. Then we see the logic of imperialism, because it follows the same sort of pointed effort at snuffing out life, at erasing people's ability to also be in connection with reality, right? And this is the piece about being in the United States, that it messes with your head. The whole point, and this is something Stephen and I take up in the book, is there is a pressure or seduction or invitation or conscription, however we want to call it, into settler colonial reality bending, or reality bending of some case, where like there's like a daily commitment that's needed of us to not engage in the reality bending that has these psychic wrecking effects. And I think that is Fanon for me across the board. It's sort of a reminder. And if you pick up the book, I mean, he does not stop. He's just like, I'm going to keep telling you this over and over and over again. It's a reminder for us how often we have to say it.
Can you give us an example of what reality bending is today in the contemporary world, so that we understand?
Yes, absolutely. So let me give an example from the settler colony of the United States, where if on a daily basis we can go around. This is not a pedantic point. This is really a something for us to contend with. On a daily basis, if we can go about and split off from reality that we are living on stolen land, and that we just come to think about that as an organic process, that they become fixtures, these colonially known places that we live and work and go about our daily lives, that they become regular fixtures, normative fixtures of our everyday life. And then they seamlessly hide. And then it becomes known as the United States, right? Or, Berkeley or LA or wherever you want to be. I think that's an example of reality bending. And that's the most like concrete and sort of easy. And so think about it as just psychic inversions that we engage in all the time that are so regularized that we don't even think about it. But if we really were to look at the logic of it, as we're saying, just like the importance of doing this in Palestine, that's why it's not pedantic. It really is such an important practice every single time to engage in the truth telling of this reality, because the seductions away from it are so regular. I would say in Palestine, it's sort of like almost thinking about how the checkpoints are meant to become a normative fixture of that topography, and the way they become regularized in terms of how people talk about them, in talking about them as crossings, mabad, or however we want to say. These are in engaging in like, this is just what is part of the topography, rather than a recognition of those as being part of the machinery of settler colonialism that's needed every day. In Palestine, it's a little easier to see, but can we transpose that to the settler colony of the United States? And how did those checkpoints transform and melt into thin air and become part of the regular topography of everyday life? That is what reality bending means.
Lara, we wanted to come to your own experience, speaking of being an Arab in America, your own experience here in the U.S. At George Washington University. Maybe you can walk us through that story, what happened, and its ongoing ramifications. And just for people who don't, well, no, you tell your story, then we'll take it from there. Actually, go ahead. Just tell us what happened, and we'll fill in the blanks as we need to.
Yes. Well, in many ways, what happened is not a story that is uncommon or unknown to all of us, right? And I think this is why it's important to name, what does it mean to be an Arab in the United States or anywhere in the world where you live constantly with the threat of something like this happening. So I was an assistant professor of psychology at George Washington University, teaching at the doctoral level. And in January 2023, I found myself being the most recent target of Stand With Us's vicious smear campaigns. And the backstory is a long one. It was an entire semester of sort of.
Wait, sorry, just for our audience who don't know, Stand With Us is one of the cogs in the Zionist and the gigantic Zionist wheel in America, but it's on the kind of I don't know how to explain that. I mean, I've crossed swords with them here in LA. There's like the kind of the dumb version. I mean, they're extraordinarily stupid people, I think, in various kinds of ways. But they're also very, very partly because of that. They're also very vicious people too. So that's who Stand With Us is. It's one of the many Zionist lobbying organizations, kind of patrolling and watching and biding its time and waiting for things to jump in on it. That's who Stand With Us is.
Yeah. And that piece, the biding its time and waiting, is a centerpiece of this, because like any of the right-wing fascistic sort of maneuvers we see, it's not like most of the time people come to them with complaints. They actually actively go around and try to, sort of entice people and say, we can help you, we will be your lawyers, and then they use lawfare to do this, right? So it's not a surprise that they filed a Title VI complaint. Anybody can file a Title VI complaint with the Department of Education, of course. And that title.
Sorry, Lara, for our audience, you need to explain what Title VI complaint is.
Yes. So it is a complaint with the Department of Education around the basis of national identity or religious identity. And again, this is why it's important, because it's actually a complaint against a university. It is not a complaint against an individual. And why I say it's important is because the day before they filed it with the Department of Education in the United States, I received an email from a right-wing rag asking me if I had commentary on this Title VI complaint that was to be filed the next day. So imagine that. Like, if you really cared about safeguarding students, first of all, why are you releasing anything to right-wing press to begin with? And then when you look at the complaint, you see that everybody's name, including administrators at the university, including everybody that had allegedly wronged these students, everybody's name was redacted except mine. And so the next day, when it sort of is filed with the Department of Education, it immediately set out a massive smear campaign against me, hate mail, threats of deportation, threats of rape, threats of bodily harm, threats of harm against my family. Stephen got a bunch of emails with sexualized threats against me, telling him to discipline me. I mean, it was the quickness with which it moved can only move like that if the infrastructure of anti-Arab, right, sentiment and Islamophobia, because of course it's always Muslim, it's sort of collapsed with Muslimness. It doesn't matter if you're a Muslim or not. It doesn't matter. And racism, because it doesn't matter how light-skinned I am as an Arab. It immediately moves into racism, use of the N-word, all these sorts of things. So the dream of Stand With Us is that Fox News would pick this up. We know that Stand With Us has tried this multiple times. I do think there's something about my being a woman, my being an assistant professor. I think there was something about low-hanging fruit, as they saw it, about being able to make an example. We know I'm not the first person who reads how they do these things. So I think they did try to go at it this way. But then on the other hand, what I was saying about it's not uncommon to us is that it follows the same tired script over and over and over again. Sort of put the name of an Arab out there and let racism and Islamophobia do its part. And it really did. And again, like I said, their dream is for Fox News to pick it up. It did. So Fox News picks it up. They put my name next to an Islamic Jihad photo and a random bomb somewhere. And that's it. That's all you need to do. What the interesting thing about this is the field of psychoanalysis starts to engage in this. And I've written a piece about this called, Settler Colonial Outposts, where it really is a reading of the ways in which the field itself, psychoanalysis, is primed for this sort of fascistic overtake, because I think Palestine is the place where we know where liberals and fascists come together. And of all the things that used to be sort of democratic principles and believe her and don't abuse women and don't harass women, all of that falls. There's a psychic collapse entirely, and people join in. What's interesting about this also is that there were outside actors of the field and people who are known to us, right? And a man who has become an academic, a retired academic, who's become a stalker, who is not a clinician, who was an English literature professor, who's on all these listservs, these psychoanalytic listservs, feeding information about me, writing 15,000 word articles about my rage, downloading my tweets. And this is the making of a global smear campaign that ends up being, detrimental to my safety, to the point that I couldn't teach on campus for an entire summer semester. And my previous employer sort of saying to me, we'll give you a classroom that locks from the inside as a way to protect me against fascists, and me saying, locking my students inside when there might be somebody coming in to get us all does not seem like a fix for this problem. And so that's what I mean. Like, now we can see this as the regular, we've seen this at a degree that we couldn't have even imagined after October 2023. But this was January 2023, and it keeps coming. Now, one thing I will say to you all is the Department of Education just came to terms with an agreement with George Washington University, my former employer. And in that filing, in that agreement with GW, it specifically says that I was found to be without fault, that there's no evidence of retaliation, that there's no evidence of discrimination, that there's no evidence that these students had seen any of my quote unquote political tweets, even though that's what Stand With Us was saying, that I created a hostile environment because I was tweeting about my pro-Palestinian, political positions. And this agreement shows that all of it was fabricated. There was a third-party investigation that was done by my university prior to the Department of Education adjudicating this 2 years later, and it found the exact same thing. And now we're at the stage where there are things being written in Israeli news and psychologists and psychoanalysts trying to whip this up all over again, because we know truth doesn't matter. It's not about truth, and it's not about protecting students. It's about silencing anti-Israel and Zionist, anti-Zionist voices.
So did the university, Lara, support you, or what was the university's role in all this? Because presumably, obviously you're innocent, and obviously you're doing your job, and obviously you're an ethical person. That goes without saying. And it should have been clear right away that these are trumped up, absurd charges. So tell me, tell us, what was the university's position on all this?
Yeah, perhaps it's not a surprise to all of us now that we can see that the university was very worried about any sort of pressure or bad campaign or anything. So the result was this third-party investigation that preempted the Department of Education, which had never happened in the history of universities before. Like, the Department of Education is the only adjudicating body. 2 weeks after this filing happens by, like what Seti said, a known right-wing fascistic organization, all of a sudden the university says, we're going to hire a third-party investigator, spend all this money to look into these claims. Now, mind you, and this is part of what I had said to my employer at the time, is there was an entire semester of documenting this from my side, because it's just something else, as you probably all know, to be in the position to see your life's work unfold in front of your eyes against you. And a part of me wanted to be like, do you want to read a chapter in our book to see exactly what we are talking about here? And this is in real time. So I had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of emails back and forth with deans and all this sort of thing that should have put the university in a position to very clearly take my side and say, we stand behind our faculty member. I think now, again, post-October 2023, we can see all the ways in which the universities are bending over backwards to try and actually circumvent their own procedures and policies to look like they're innocent on claims that are not even true, right? They're made up and specious claims, and then they're defended. So it's like they're defending ghosts. And that's why they seem and sound ridiculous, because they're coming up against arguments that are not even real. And that's what happened. And there was a 3-month investigation, and I was cleared on March 27th, 2023. And April 4th, 2023, the Department of Education announced that it would be opening up its investigation. So the win of that external investigation was not long-lived. But here we are, 2 years later, and it matches, surprise, surprise, exactly what I had proved, what the deans had come to, the conclusion of at the end of 2022, and what the external investigation had also already proven.
Yeah, all these things now in the U.S. are on. They're on, like it's what you went through was abominable, but it speaks to the general position here in the U.S. where universities, if there's any whiff of a complaint from the other side, they're on it, in a flash, and they suspend and they do all the stuff that they do. But when we we say, yeah, but what about what's happening to us? No, it just goes into echoing silence, crickets in the hallways. Nothing happened. I mean, I could tell you stories about our own where I am here, or many other universities. It's not the truth content of the narrative that matters. It's the social and political networks into which the narrative is inserted. And of course, the key strength of Zionism in the U.S. is its institutional flex, the fact that it has all of these, so that the slightest little narrative that goes into the ziosphere here can quickly get amplified. And it's not just Fox News, but now, of course, it goes to Congress. There's congressional witch hunts and congressional committees and all this kind of stuff that goes on. And it's Zionism's incredible capacity to amplify distortions of even things that aren't true. They could take on a life of their own. And of course, we see that right now. It's kind of extraordinary. So there's two things kind of running in parallel here. There's, again, to come back to psychological terms, there's a sort of Zionist narcissism, which is incredibly powerful. It's sort of all-consuming, as far as I'm not a psychologist, but as far as I can tell. And then there's also a kind of the power that's the flip side of the narcissism, which is, as I said, this capacity to they can invent things, or they can just hear little stories and take them and amplify them, be out of all proportion into these all-consuming things. And then, because they have the attention of the media, because they have the attention, obviously, of politicians, because that's how the American political system works, and so forth. These narratives can take on a life of their own, and then they go on to distort lives and so forth. Yeah. So I don't know, just a little. I'd like to just reflect briefly on the narcissistic component to this. I think it is fascinating to think about Zionist narcissism here, especially here in the U.S. I mean, they have in occupied Palestine, it's a different thing, but here in the U.S., there's a kind of narcissistic tendency that is incredibly powerful. I just wonder if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, here's where I would thank you for sort of an opening to the psychological here. This is precisely what I would mean by sort of psychological warfare, that the realm of the psyche is a precise place to sort of intervene, because I don't think it's by chance that it finds synergy in another settler colony, that the infrastructure is already there for that. And while narcissism, I hear it and it coheres around that as a pathological, why I tend to move away from that is because there's an invitation back into the individual. I don't think you're saying that, but my worry is that it goes back into the individual pathology that can also be cured and healed, right? If we're in the realm of psychology, we're also saying that potentially this is something that can be reformed. Whereas if we think about it as an ideological position, of which narcissism could be a part, because an ideological position, a political position, is one that you have to adhere to very, sort of persistently. And it has to cohere around a certain set of structures that includes your superiority, that you're the only one being harmed, that any mention, this is back to Osama's question of like, what's reality bending here? Like any mention of Palestine is de facto a invitation to erase Judaism, the collapse of Judaism with Zionism, all these sorts of things, that this coheres an ideological position that people then psychologically have to actually commit to. Like I often say, there isn't a way for people to, today I'm committing to this ideology and tomorrow I'm not. There's a whole mechanics of psychological commitments that end up happening that kind of manifest in these entitlements. And like you're saying, the synergy in a settler colony of the United States with the logics of settler colonialism of the Zionist entity matches perfectly. And so you end up having this sort of invitation where the settler colonial entitlement and violence can be played out in in an outpost of sorts. But one other thing that
Lara,
I just want to say one last thing is that it follows the logic of expansionism. If we can think about Zionism as an expansionist project, and that's its ideological core, including supremacy and all that, then extending into the realm of the psyche and contesting spaces like educational spaces and all of that feels like a logical extension of that expansionist logic. And for it to be expansionist, it has to come to live inside of us. It has to be internalized, because then it also, there are ways in which we become disciplining of ourselves and of each other, and it does the work through us. Sorry, Osama.
No, I was just going to say, so what is to be done in that sense? I mean, it sounds like it sounds overwhelming. And how does one avoid this disciplining of oneself, as you're saying? Because it's true for all of us who are living here, but even I suppose for you in Doha, Karim, and Beirut, I mean, these things work at different registers. I'm wondering, so what is one to do in these situations,
Yeah.
given the overwhelming nature of this?
I think going through this experience actually provided me an opportunity to really crunch analytically and intellectually what was happening. Because like I said, you are right, it is overwhelming and it's terrifying and it's scary and they're actually dangerous. Like my life was actually in danger. So committing to kind of returning back to the condition actually helped me. And it created what I would call like psychic space. In those moments when I felt collapses happening, it was a reminder to me. It was almost like, this is where I mean about symptom as register. It was registering, there's something larger playing on me and through me. And this is a moment to be attentive. And for me to say, what are the logics of this and how am I being used in a particular way? That can't happen in isolation. I can't do that alone. And this is not to return, community is complicated, and I don't mean this in like a surface way. But for us, even something like this, or for us to come together with comrades or continuously come back to the condition that is causing this, rather than the seduction of an individual sort of target. If I had understood this as an individual targeting of me, of course I was the individual involved in this. But what we saw come October 2023 was all we needed to see, that this is not an individual process, that there's an entire infrastructure that SETI's talking about that includes the media class, that includes sort of the donors, that includes all this, the functioning of neoliberal education. And those were the things that for us to continuously come back to that with the fervor and the persistence on which the reality bending insists on making itself known every single day. And in those moments when we're pulled to despair, when we're pulled to feel helpless and overwhelmed, is to track that and say, here are all the moving pieces and the mechanics to return back to Fanon. If we take it seriously and say that the material world cannot be excised from the psychic, can't be separated, what are the ways in which we can commit to a sort of a determined study of the ways that these psychological operations work? And again, to remember that this is not an accidental effect of Zionism, but actually a centerpiece of its violence. And, our political prisoners teach us that all the time, about how breaking people psychologically, which includes us, is one way in which people are taken offline. Our movements are depoliticized and we get demobilized, right? But again, being in spaces that love you, that remind you, that are able to call you in and be like, hey, this is a condition, not an individual encounter, I feel like it's the only way. And that's the piece that I'm calling militant clarity, is sort of like really leaning into militancy in the psychic realm, just as much as in our linguistic sort of preciseness and precision and all of that.
Lara, I want to shift back towards your book and towards the cases of psychoanalysis under occupation and things like this. But just to follow up on this, you kind of moved to Doha, and for people like me in Beirut, sort of coming from the U.S. context to places like Doha and Beirut and other places, how does that journey affect what you're saying? I mean, it's a different kind of politics. I think politically and psychologically, you're surrounded by, I should imagine, more sympathetic kind of people on that level, at least at a certain level. But at the same time, you're also in a certain area as well, and it's sort of in a weird space, and regionally, but also professionally among comrades and others as well. I know there are people there as well. So how did that work? And then I'd like to kind of move on to your work on Palestine.
Of course, of course. You know, it's there's two sides to this. On the one hand, I immediately registered what it felt like to be outside the grips of empire, in the middle of empire, and I've been living there for almost 2 decades. So to come here and feel like immediately, it just, you feel it viscerally. Like نحن ببلاد العرب, and I hear Arabi, and there's a way in which the language is different, and you don't have to do the code switching. Actually, being here challenged me to be more precise about what are the things that I was doing on a daily basis that were hidden to me. So a lot of the things that I'm thinking through flow through me. Like I'm not separate to this, right? To these phenomena. So being more precise about like, oh, what are the ways in which I do censor myself, even though, people who know me and Zionists would think like this is censorship. I'm just like, internally, what are the things we end up doing to soften our language, to be legible, to be palatable, all the things. Here, it really challenged me and humbled me to be like, oh, wow, what does it mean when I can walk into a room and I don't have to do all of this? How does that reconfigure things? So immediately a relief and a realignment in a way that reminded me about the importance of grounding ourselves in the global South, really about what that means. Now, on the other hand, it opens up other contradictions, and that's just the truth, right? The contradictions of being in Doha, the contradictions of like what Osama was saying, like you being in Beirut brings on different questions of what it is that we're up against and what's the type of clarity we need, right? So being in Doha, on the one hand, feeling like there's political safety in a way that there isn't in America, but what are other things that if I just close my eyes and said, oh, I feel safe here, what are the things that I'm missing out on, right? What's the different level of surveillance that's here? What are the certain narratives that we still need to commit to being very clear on so that we're not conscripted into a different type of hierarchy and sort of psychological process? But I think I needed to actually feel in my body what it felt like to be closer to home and what it means to feel alienated. I wasn't born in America. So, but the wear and tear over, 2 decades is real. And it allowed me a space to kind of reconvene and think and then continue to be loud.
Yeah, no, that's so sorry. I just wanted to follow up on this because I think it's interesting because I think Doha is probably the same as Beirut in the sense of the idea of Palestine itself is not so contested. I mean, there's not, if you talk about Palestine, so it's not, there's nobody's going to jump down your throat as you would be in the American or Western context that you've been talking about. Here, perhaps it's more about questions of resistance and the kind of other matters. So in America, Palestine means resistance. I mean, at a certain level. Here, it's not Palestine per se, because everybody, even the most right-wing people, can say, yeah, we're with Gaza, we're with Palestinians, we're with Palestine. It's just we don't want it here. And so the questions of what resistance means and what the larger Israeli expansionist projects are. This is where one is careful institutionally and politically. It's I don't think people are being doxxed at this point, but I don't know how far away we are from that, depending on how regional politics kind of moves in this direction.
Yes, absolutely. And the question of normalization, I've had to be very careful about like because I'm in the Arab world, what I hear a lot is like, we're here, therefore we're acting in a decolonial sense, or we do stuff in Arabi, therefore it's decolonial. I'm like, no, that's actually not. We have to be actually even more careful because of the relaxation of our shoulders around Palestine. What are the things we need to attune to that are happening that actually have a really big impact on this question of liberation and for our larger region?
Lara, is it harder? Like I keep thinking about this. Is it harder to be in a place where when in terms of the psychic harm and in terms of the difficulty and the contradictions, when it's Arabs, when it's people, your own community, our own community, who are the ones who are being sort of denying and involved in sort of normalizing and so on? Isn't that much more difficult in a sense than dealing with the Zionists outside? Or is that a different? I mean, how does one reconcile that? Because I keep thinking there was a huge event in Lebanon, as you know, over the past week, and the levels of hatred and the levels of vitriol and the levels of propaganda and the dehumanization is stunning. And I'm wondering how one deals with that, and like how do you compartmentalize these two different sort of assaults on your and our collective well-being?
Yeah, such a beautiful invitation to go back to it. At the risk of repeating myself, is going back to the Fanonian like condition. And that really does help me, because native informant, that's the native bourgeoisie are the ones we have to be worried about. It's easy to see colonizers. It's easy to see what they're after, but to come back to the condition that creates both the condition of the colonizer to oppress the colonized, and then for that condition of coloniality to continue afterwards. And that's the piece that I think I'm contending with all the time. In fact, I feel it hurts a lot more. I think all of us can see that. It feels mind-boggling, probably at a level that's not. Like the coherence of a settler coming at you makes sense. It's part of the expansionist project. And then to see how people internalize that colonialism and engage in this sort of amnesia that is meant to happen. That is part of what colonialism does, right? Nadira talks about dismemberment, and we can talk about it about psychic amnesia, of separating us from our histories and having every moment in time be a new moment that is not connected to these histories of fighting and liberation and that are connected across the board. It hurts a lot more. And I think it demands a lot more out of me, because my impulse is to, again, like we were saying before to Karim, is that when you let down, there's a way in which maybe your acuity is also a little less. And so having to be on and really think about all the textures of this type of mechanics, like you're talking about, Osama, right? But it is a reminder that we need to approach that with the same ferocity as anything else, because it's part of the same condition. In native folks coming up and siding with power is not new. And it's for us to be like, what is the condition that created this? And how do we disrupt that at all costs in service of our larger liberation?
Lara, to kind of get to this final section that we really want to talk about, which is your work on Palestine, I'm thinking, what's going on these days, especially over the past year. How does one even approach the idea of trauma and psychoanalysis for people in Palestine today? Gaza for sure, but even outside of Gaza in general. How does one take the approach that you're talking about in this specific case?
Yeah. In many ways, in the same ways as people on the ground have been doing all along. And I think that was the point of the book for Stephen and myself, is to be like, when we think about psychoanalysis, we don't think about it as happening in Palestine, but every clinician in that book, it's sort of a love letter to them and the ways in which they're excavating their work and their life alongside their patients under conditions that are otherwise unimaginable to the fantasy world of, colonizing minds or settler minds or white minds or people who never think about Palestine, period. So the acuteness with which I think the horrific acts that we've seen, the genocidal acts, have increased traumatic responses is something for us to pay attention to. But if we're thinking about it as a sort of extension, it helps us, and my learning alongside people in Palestine, it helps us really go to task and really challenge the entire, what I call the trauma industry, right? Is that if we are invited constantly to think about this context of PTSD, which Nadia Abul-Hajj, beautifully does a beautiful job sort of mapping out how the whole construct in and of itself came as a deflective mode for American people to identify with the soldiers rather than with the people in Vietnam that were actually the victims of this entire machinery. And so I feel like, again, it is a reminder, it is a commitment for us to say this framing of trauma is one that will always be a failing project and a failing gaze to really represent the magnitude of what is happening and the source of suffering. Because everybody wants somebody who's traumatized, but nobody wants you to name who the traumatizer is, right? Everybody's arms wide open. Think about international law, refugees. Yes, we will accept you. Of course, I'm being facetious here, but they will accept somebody who's traumatized. But the second you name who your traumatizer is, that is when things start to go haywire. And I think what is happening in Gaza or across Palestine or in Jenin right now, or any one of these things, is a call for clinicians who take their work seriously, and for any of us to say, every field that has been used to stabilize a system of oppression is one that needs to be contested, is one that needs to be pushed up against, is one that needs to be named, is one that should not be allowed to function as though it is normative and organic and isn't open for critique, right? And that's the piece here. So what I will say technically on the ground is I'm in contact with folks on the ground who are doing incredible mental health work, whether it's in Gaza or across Palestine, because they are of the space and might be attuned to what are the needs of the community. That might not look like the version of trauma interventions that are prescribed or told to people. And certainly you're not going to be doing it in a sterilized clinic and, one-on-one or any one of these things. But the interventions are there. And I think it's for us to, again, push ourselves around what constitutes these interventions. Where do they happen? How do we help people? And how do we do this work without demanding that people who need our help or access care do so at the expense of the centrality of their being, right? Like naming who their traumatizer is.
Lara, I don't think we could rap more eloquently than how you just did, so I think we can stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, all of you. يعطيكم العافية.
Allah Afiki, and congratulations on being cleared for something you never did.
Thank you, right?
That's the absurdity of it all. And thank you for all your work, Lara. Reality bending indeed. Thank you, Lara.
All right, hi guys. What did you think of that discussion with Lara?
I thought I think Lara is incredible. I think she's gone through an extraordinary, first of all, incredibly brilliant in terms of her analysis and in terms of her scholarship, but then in terms of what happened to her, Sadi and Karim, the kind of the witch hunt against her, and the sense that she said of this business of feeling in a sense alone and being censored. And then she said when she went to Doha, Karim, you must feel like this too. Getting out of the U.S. in a sense, you feel a sense of you let your guard down in a sense. You don't feel quite as besieged as one does here. So I thought it was an incredibly instructive session, let alone the whole discussion of Fanon. Karim, what do you think?
No, I totally agree. I think it was a brilliant discussion. I learned a lot, and I think I think it would be sort of interesting to have talked more also about her own work on Palestine and some of the cases that she had that she's written a lot about, and the kind of the ways in which, I mean, I struggle to think about how, when we have our everyday problems and we try to go to a therapist, you do this, you do that, and can you imagine being in these kinds of conditions and having to think in these terms, and how does one rehabilitate, not just physically, and fix one's house and one's community and the schools and the university, all the things that are somehow apparent and kind of obvious. But how does one repair one's psyche, one's mind, one's just try to clear it in a situation of ongoing genocide and now ethnic cleansing and war and this, I don't think this is stopping anytime soon. So it's not like, okay, it ends, Gaza has ended, so now bring in the therapists and bring in the psyche, these people, and that's it goes on. It's not even going to stop. And it's multi-generational at this stage. So how does one even think about it? I can perhaps understand academically how one would write about it in a kind of longue durée and put it historically and politically, but the practice of it, which is what she was referring to as well, and she works on, that's extraordinary. For me, that's I still can't really wrap my head around it. Sadi, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, even if you wanted to have therapy, I don't know where people like in Gaza are going to get therapy from. I mean, it's the level of trauma and damage is mind-boggling. Nobody can wrap their minds around it. And I mean, the work Lara's doing and her book with Stephen, it's extraordinary. The kind of the cases they talk about and the situations they talk about and document. And obviously, it's Fanonian practice in the best possible sense of reconnecting the individual psyche to this larger community and set of context and social circumstances and so forth. It's very powerful. I mean, I also think her experience here is, it's indicative of all of us. This experience of being an Arab in America is under the best of circumstances is difficult and challenging, but it's never been more difficult and challenging than the past 15, 16 months. It's on hyper levels I mean, all of us feel kind of schizophrenic and insane here, partly because, for all the trauma we're witnessing in Palestine and obviously in Lebanon too, but we're always the ones who are made to feel like we have to go around tiptoeing and apologizing for hurting people's feelings here in America. It's truly extraordinary. And the level of repression, it's extraordinary.
That is it. And so how does one reconcile that? I wish we could have asked you this question, but how does one reconcile this idea of the trauma of the Palestinians and the Lebanese, but especially the Palestinians in Gaza, who've gone through genocide and who are going through genocide and who are going to, I mean, how does one, as Karim said, it's an ongoing thing. It doesn't just stop. It keeps going and going and going and getting more and more malevolent with each passing day, and the cruelty, the sheer levels of cruelty. How does one sort of cope with that at one level, insofar as they can survive, let alone cope? And then you have, as you said, Sadi, here we're dealing with denial, an extraordinary amount of gaslighting and denial. How does one, what is one to do in that situation? And then Karim, you're in your situation in Lebanon, where you have, as Lara was saying, she was saying the natives who are, she put it, and of course the native folks, she said, coming up and siding with power. I mean, it's a phrase she used, and it, again, so there's a tripartite, or there's this triple issue that all of us are collectively dealing with. It is an extraordinary. She really shed a lot of light on this.
Yeah, especially her duality. I mean, occupying both positions, both having been here in the U.S. and now being in the Arab world. It's true. When we're in the Arab world, you just feel like you can breathe again. You don't have this, I mean,
You can breathe only on that.
No,
at
yeah,
a certain
obviously,
level,
yeah,
that's what she was saying. I mean, there's a lot of other levels where we believe we can't
no, of
breathe,
course,
including
I know.
including the diesel fumes.
No, I know,
in Beirut.
but there is some. I mean, there is a place. It's in the Arab world is where you suddenly feel at least your body and mind and soul are all in the same place at the same time. Whereas here in America, it's always, we're always being torn. It's incredible. And this thing now that, the past year and a half, the experience has been one of what Osama just mentioned, the levels of brutality. Instead of people focusing on this unbelievable form of violence, collective violence that the Israelis are inflicting on Palestinians, mostly in Gaza, but also now in the West Bank, and of course in Lebanon too.
In Lebanon as well.
Instead of focusing on the levels of devastation and destruction and sadism and pathological violence that the Israelis are inflicting willfully, and every day they say things, obviously that never come to the American press. Nobody here ever talks about them. They say,
and they're open about it, Sadi, right? And they're open about it.
In their own stuff. Yeah, it's just they exterminate the brutes and we must kill them all.
Yeah, it's explicit.
All and starve them all and bomb. It's just endless bloodthirst. But then you come here in America, and it's all like everybody's tiptoeing to make sure that certain people's feelings aren't hurt, and it becomes all about this other subject position. Just I wanted to raise. Sorry, one last thing. I wanted to raise this point about, in the context of the Oscars last night. I don't know if you saw the ceremony last night, but that film No Other Land won Best Documentary, which is in and of itself is kind of miraculous because it has, of course, yet again, it's never been touched by any American distributor. So you can't, basically, an Oscar-winning film that can't be seen in the U.S. because of Zionist censorship. But the amazing thing was that, yes, of course, there's a Palestinian and an Israeli, director. And of course, who steals the platform at the Oscars is the Israeli guy. So it becomes all about him again, right? So this film, which is about Palestine and the Palestinians, about that one guy, Bassett, the Israeli guy wants to take it over, make it all about his experience too. It's kind of, they never know when to just be quiet. It's we've seen it. I'm sure.
Yeah, it's just a bit, as she said, I think we should. We're Sadi, especially you and me, given in this country, that where Palestine, she said, is where the liberals and the fascists come together It's absolutely true. It's a Palestine exception. And Karim, the interesting thing is that, as you said, in Lebanon, you have a space to breathe. You can breathe in the sense on this issue, as you said. But there's so many other areas where the the liberals and the fascists there are coming together as well. But anyway, guys, thank you very much, as always.
Yeah, it's different. Sorry, but it just I just wanted to emphasize that it's a different. What where you get to breathe is that you don't have to. If you say Zionist or if you say Palestine or something, you don't have to then spend
An hour trying to
25 minutes
justify what you're
and
saying.
pull out the footnotes and saying everything. That's true, but there is a lot of other things that you guys don't have to deal with because that's not part of your thing over
Absolutely.
there that we have to deal with in Lebanon and in the region. That's also maybe a topic for a different podcast.
All right. Thank you, guys.